The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Peter began to say to him, "Behold, we have left everything and followed you." Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house, or brothers or sisters, or mother or father, or children, or farms, for my sake and for the sake of the gospel, but that will receive 100 times as much now in this present age, houses and brothers and sisters, and mothers and children and farms, along with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life." Words inspired by God. My good friend Arlen Brownstein never learned to cook. She grew up in a household where, when she was still a teenager, her mother made a declaration one day, "I'm done, I'm not cooking anymore." So she never spent time in the kitchen cooking. And then about 3 years ago, she decided she wanted to learn how to cook. So at this stage, she has now 2 big binders full of recipes that she's gleaned from lots of different people and lots of different areas. And she loves it. She's cooking up a storm at this stage. So yesterday, she'd come across a recipe a few days ago called Peruvian chicken. Carmen, have you ever heard of it? Okay. So she's studying this Peruvian chicken, and she spends 6 or 7 hours marinating the chicken pieces and creating all kinds of spices. And yesterday evening, I got to eat it, and it was absolutely delicious. And as I'm eating this chicken, I'm beginning to think, it's amazing how you can take the same object, in this instance, a chicken, and by using just different recipes, or cooking it a little bit differently, or combining the elements a little bit differently, you can come up with a totally new taste. And so you take a chicken, and if you want to go to a fast food restaurant, you can have Kentucky Fried Chicken, or go to McDonald's and you can have chicken nuggets, which are marinated in sawdust, or you could go to an Indian restaurant and you could have chicken Tikka Masala, which is one of my favorites. Or if you're Irish, you could just throw chicken into a pot and boil it until it gives up. Or you could do Peruvian chicken. But they're basically all the same basic ingredient, just combined differently and cooked a little bit differently. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because I want to talk about cooking a cosmology. How you can cook cosmologies in very, very different ways. And I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. Firstly, I'm just going to do a little introductory piece to it. And then secondly, I want to talk about probably my favorite cosmologist, a guy called Campbell. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about from the journey from source to incarnation. And then finally, reincarnation practice makes perfect. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, just a few introductory remarks. In the same way that you could take the basic item, a chicken, and by treating it differently, or using slightly different recipes, or cooking, combining the elements in a different fashion, you can have a totally different taste experience. In the very same way, you can take the cosmological data, you can take your own experiences in life, and depending on how you run them through the template of cosmology, you can have a totally different idea of the underlying reality. So all you need is to overlay the data, the same experiences you've always had, overlay the data with a different kind of a template and different kinds of terminology. Because part of the problem with our cosmologies is that the words we've been using since we were kids have a lot of baggage attached to them. So they don't always mean what we think they mean. So for instance, the word God or soul or spirit has such a long, long history that when you use these terms in your cosmology, people will misunderstand it or have reactions to it. People who've been raised in fundamentalist Christian households don't want to hear the word God or soul or spirit. So it's like you have to do 2 things in order to kind of, in this instance, smuggle chickens into the diet or smuggle a cosmology into people's thinking. You have to try to change the template and you've got to change the terminology a little bit. So for a few moments this morning, that's what I'm going to attempt to do. I'm going to put two templates on the same data and see what emerges through each template. And one of the templates is from this cosmologist, a guy called Tom Campbell. And side by side with that, I'm going to put my own template. And it's a template that I've evolved. Some of it is original thinking, but I've evolved it over 73 years of being a Catholic and 29 years of formal education in mathematics and science, in psychology, in theology and scripture, so as well as 56 years of meditation practice. So that's kind of the system through which my cosmology has emerged. And I want to put that side by side with the cosmology of Tom Campbell, which I really, really love, and show what happens when you just use a different template and different nomenclature. So that's just the introduction. So who is Tom Campbell? Tom Campbell is a 75-year-old American. He's a physicist. His PhD was in experimental nuclear physics. And he spent 30 years working as a contractor with the Department of Defense in charge of programs on experimental nuclear physics. Really, really brilliant guy. And he spent about 20 years working with NASA, advising them particularly on the safety and the risks attached to the shuttle experiments they were doing. But as well as being a brilliant physicist, he's also what you might call a psychonaut. A psychonaut is a term for people who like to travel in their minds. So like an astronaut or a cosmonaut, except they're traveling inside their own minds and they're trying to figure stuff out, experimentally in some ways. So he took up meditation, transcendental meditation, as a young man and has been practicing it ever since. And that was part of his introduction to becoming a psychonaut. As well as that, he was the scientist who helped Robert Monroe set up the Monroe Institute. It's a place, I think it's in Virginia, where people are taught how to do out-of-body travel, to have OBEs, out-of-body experiences, by traveling volitionally in the astral realms. And his function as the scientist was to set up research protocols that would teach people how to do that and how to report the experiences they're having in these altered states of consciousness. And then a few years ago, he wrote his magnum opus, his really, really big book. And I mean a big book. This is a huge tome. It's a trilogy. And it's called, tongue-in-cheek, it's called My Big T.O.E. And T.O.E. is an acronym. It stands for Theory of Everything. And so since the time of Einstein, scientists have been trying to create a theory of everything, something that can unify the four great forces, the weak and the strong nuclear forces, electromagnetism and gravity. And Einstein spent the best part of the second half of his life trying to figure out how you could pull these together and never succeeded. And there's been no successful T.O.E., no successful theory of everything. But Tom Campbell has come up with this extraordinary trilogy, and it's really, really, it's a great read. The first part is autobiographical, and then he's talking about helping to set up the Monroe Institute and travels outside of the body, and then he has his own theory as to how this thing works. And so what he does in this extraordinary trilogy is he combines relativity theory, quantum mechanics, metaphysics, and consciousness. So he's bringing all these things together in what he calls his big T.O.E., his big theory of everything. And he only has two assumptions or two postulates. Now it's very important, when you're trying to create any theory, you can't start from scratch. Probably the most brilliant mathematician of the 20th century was a guy called Kurt Gödel. He was an Austrian mathematician. And he came up with a theory which is called the incompleteness theorem. And it says this, it says, and it's definitely proven, that no axiomatic system of mathematics or science or philosophy can be both consistent and complete. You have to have at least one postulate that you have to take on faith. There is no branch of science, not even mathematics, which is the queen of the sciences, which is not based on at least one postulate. When I was studying math in college, there were 5 postulates. They were called the Peano postulates. And so what happens is, the fewer postulates you have, the more consistent your model is going to be, but it takes a lot longer to erect this model. If you have a whole bunch of postulates, you can build a lot faster, but it's far less consistent. And the image I've used in the past is, imagine you want to get your house painted, and you employ a house painter. And this guy comes and he does it on his own, and he spends 3 weeks painting your house. It's going to take a lot of time, but it's going to be very consistent because it's the same guy with the same brushes, the same job. If you bring in a team of people, 5 guys, each guy doing his own thing, it'll go a lot faster, but there'll be far less consistency. The paint will be slightly different in different places. Now that's true in mathematics, it's true in science, it's true in everything. That no axiomatic system, it can be both complete and consistent. You have to start with at least one postulate. Now for Tom Campbell, he starts just with 2 postulates and he builds his Big T.O.E on this. And the 2 postulates are that consciousness exists and that evolution is a fact. They're the only 2 postulates. If you can accept those 2 things, he'll build this entire thing that can explain relativity theory, quantum mechanics, metaphysics, and the paranormal, all kinds of paranormal activity on this one thing. And so that's kind of who he is as he gets started with this big theory of everything. So what does that look like? That's my third point then. I'm going to call it the journey from source to incarnation. And so I'm going to be using 2 kinds of sets of nomenclature, 2 kinds of terminologies to show you what Tom is saying and the model that I'm operating of and the similarities between them when you just understand the different words that are being used. So what you and I would call God or source or the one, Tom calls the larger consciousness system. The larger consciousness system. So Tom is of the opinion that there is a consciousness which predates the cosmos completely. So you can call it God or source or whatever, but that this consciousness is responsible for everything. But this larger consciousness, since it has to generate experiences in order to expand itself. If you're the only thing that exists, you can't really have experiences of other. If you are God and you are the mountains and the cosmos and the self, there's no experiences possible. So the second part is this larger consciousness system, or God, or source, whatever you want to call it, it spins off holographic fractals of itself. And you find the same teaching in Judaism, in the Kabbalah. And he calls these what we would call souls, or Atman, he would call individuated units of consciousness. So it's just a different name, basically, for the same thing. So you have the larger consciousness system, or God, which spins off fractals of itself, which are then individuated units of consciousness, little bite-sized pieces of God, a term that I've used many, many times. So then each of these souls is like a holographic fractal of the larger consciousness system. Now, in order then to have an incarnational experience, this individuated unit of consciousness, or this soul, it has to spin off a subset of itself. And Hinduism will call this jiva. He calls it the free will awareness unit. And so this individual unit of consciousness wants to incarnate, and therefore it needs free will. And it needs to be on planet Earth or some other planet. So it creates a subset of itself. Now, this is exactly what Hinduism teaches, the difference between Atman and Jiva, the 2 birds sitting on a tree. Atman is the part of the soul that never incarnates, and Jiva is the bird that swoops down onto the planet and pecks around at the seeds, and then comes back up on the tree branch, and they debrief together, Atman and Jiva. So he's going to call Jiva, he's going to call it a free will awareness unit. But in order to actually have the experience on the ground, there needs to be, the 4th term he uses is an avatar, a driver of the spacesuit. And we might call that the ego, or the personality, or the identity that you have. So he will call that the avatar. So the avatar really is basically the driver of the spacesuit. So now you've got 4 sections to it. You've got the larger consciousness system, or God. You've got the individuated unit of consciousness that we might call the soul. You've got the free will awareness unit, which we might call the jiva, the part of the soul that incarnates. And then you have the avatar, the kind of the driver of the spacesuit, the personality, or the ego. So that's basically, very, very briefly, if you want to boil down his 900 pages of a theory down to 1 paragraph, that would be pretty much what it is. So what can you do with this then? Which brings me to my fourth point. And I've titled this Reincarnation, Practice Makes Perfect. So according to Tom then, when on the death of the physical body, the avatar dissolves completely. So the fourth component just dissolves. When the physical body dies, the driver of the spacesuit is no longer necessary. The driver is gone. And then all of the experiences go back up to the individual, to the free awareness unit. So Jiva is taking all of the information back up to source. So the avatar is gone, it's dissolved, it won't be necessary until the next incarnation, but the free will awareness unit taking all of that information and goes back home with all that information. So in some senses, he's building up the library. It's building up the library of what Hindus might call the Akashic records, which is the storage place for all of the experiences of all creatures who've ever lived any place whatsoever. Now, what happens then when reincarnation occurs? So reincarnation, you still have the larger consciousness system. You still have the individuated unit of consciousness. You still have the free will awareness unit, but now you're going to need a new avatar. You're going to need a new driver because you're going into a brand new spacesuit. You're going into a totally different drama. And the drama might be, in a completely different location, at a different era in human history, and there might be a totally different plot to this new drama that you take on. So everything is the same in a sense, except the avatar is newly created to kind of drive this new space suit. And so imagine it's like the difference between, let's say, an actor and the roles he plays. So I'm going to just pick one, like, for instance, Tom Hanks. So Tom Hanks would be like the free will awareness unit that came from the individuated unit of consciousness that was spun off by Source, our larger consciousness system. But Tom Hanks is going to be playing roles in many, many totally different dramas. So I don't know if you've seen him in the recent movie, Mr. Rogers, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. So yeah, it's in kind of America of the 1950s or 60s. And he's this beautiful character. Or he played the role of Forrest Gump, this kind of retarded individual, really, really wise in his own way. He played a role in Saving Private Ryan, if you remember that one. He played a role in Sleepless in Seattle. He played a role in My Great Fat, what was it called? Big Fat Greek Wedding. Remember that one? So they're totally different dramas set in different places and different times, but it's the same guy playing all of the roles. So in some senses then, the Jiva, or the free will awareness unit, is inhabiting totally different spacesuits and creating totally different avatars in order to have that experience. So what survives the end of an incarnation? Again, the avatar is gone. But what happens is everything above the avatar benefits from the experience of incarnation. So the free will awareness unit has grown. It's generated a whole bunch of experiences. And it takes that back up onto the tree branch and it shares them with Atman. So the soul benefits from the experience of incarnation. In other words, the individuated unit of consciousness benefits from the experience of incarnation. But not only that, but the larger consciousness system, God, or the source, also benefits. Because that's the way in which God generates experiences. And in Tom's version, and in another theology, God also develops. God develops through her incarnational experiences. So you have to differentiate between the ineffability of source in some senses and the kind of the transcendence, ineffability, and the immanence of God as she incarnates. So everything benefits all the ways up. The three top tiers benefit from the experience of incarnation. So the conclusion is something like this then. Each of us is now in a brand new drama. Each of us has starred in hundreds, maybe even thousands of other dramas. We had different personalities, maybe we changed gender, different locations, different periods in human history. But all of those experiences are part of who we are. And we keep coming back in order to become better and better actors. So not that we can win Oscars. It's not about, winning Oscars. I mean acting in the sense that each lifetime, and each incarnation affords us the opportunity of learning to love more deeply and to be more and more compassionate and more forgiving. So we're developing our acting skills in the sense that we are benefiting everything above us. We're benefiting Jiva, we're benefiting, Atman, we're benefiting Source completely. So as you review Tom's model this morning, you think about these 4 levels. Who do you want to be while you're still driving the car? While there's an avatar, in your spacesuit, driving this particular incarnation. Whom do you want to become? What do you want to develop? So that, when you shuffle off this mortal coil, what you're uploading to the free will awareness unit or the individuated unit of consciousness or the larger consciousness system, whether you're uploading it to Jiva or Atman or God or Self, what do you want to be uploading when this incarnation is done?